How's everybody doing?
نشكر ربنا.
لا ما تردوش كلكم مرة واحدة كده. How's everybody doing?
نشكر ربنا.
الحمد لله ممكن تروح.
Please, never again. All
That's
right.
amazing.
So, what did you guys talk about last week?
I don't think no, I don't remember either.
What?
And the week before.
And the week before.
I wasn't here, but like according to context clues, Isaac.
Very smart, you know your Bible. Jacob today, Isaac last week. Very good, very good. Very proud of you. All right, so you guys talked about Isaac.
I was not here last week either. I didn't even look at the context.
And I'm going to need your pencil.
I'm gonna
because we're
take it
gonna
off. No, you're not gonna remember the past.
Alright.
I'm gonna take it off.
So you guys talked about Isaac, and I listened to the talk, and I realized Ehab did a really good job covering the life of Isaac. And I think he covered some of the characteristics of God in the story without saying that he's covering the characteristics of God. So we'll take like literally 3 minutes. You can, put it on your watch. And we're just gonna go through a couple of characteristics of God in the Isaac story. And there's really one that I wanna actually focus on. But you're more than welcome to suggest characteristics that you saw when Ehab was talking that maybe he didn't cover out loud, right? But for me, one of the biggest characteristics for God in Isaac was our God is the God of the 11th hour, right? Why? Why is he God of the 11th hour? This is definitely going to be an interactive situation. Otherwise, I will just leave.
I'm right
أكلم
here.
نفسي.
I'm right here.
Why is God the God of the 11th hour for Isaac?
Is it
Do we
because
know who Isaac is?
Yes,
Very
I know who
good.
Isaac is, but-
Why, take a guess, why is God the God of the 11th hour? First of all, do we even know what the 11th hour is?
It's
It's in the Bible, right? We talk about it a lot, like
Yeah.
last minute, right? Like God is like last minute, the 11th hour. Why is God the God of the 11th hour? Sahla. What was happening to Isaac
Isaac was saved at the last minute
when?
when he was gonna be.
Very good, alhamdulillah. The defining moment in Isaac's life when he was about to become a sacrifice, right? And to us, this is the moment in Isaac's life that really painted the picture that Isaac is a type of Christ, right? So in Isaac's life, that defining moment is also a defining moment for the God that saved him, right? So I want you guys to think like that when you're reading the Bible, like, okay, Isaac's defining moment is that he was saved in the last minute. What does that tell me about God? God sometimes waits to the last minute, right? Not all the time.
Kinda
Not all the
teasing
time.
you, to be
Maybe
honest.
he's doing something special with you, but not all the time, right? But there's a lot of times where God is the God of the 11th hour, right?
God likes to tease.
We see that, for example, with the apostles when they were in the boat, right? And the storm, and they all thought they were about to die, even though he was in the boat. But what did Jesus do? He went to sleep.
Yep.
And then he was like, right when they thought they were about to die, and they finally woke him up, he basically woke up and he's like, "Sahuni day, like, right? Like, why are you guys even waking me up? Like, shouldn't you have faith that nothing's gonna happen to you?" But then he quelled the storm. But in their mind, that was the 11th hour because they were about to die. The difference is, what I'm saying is God of the 11th hour because that's how we see it, right? The character of God is revealed in how we view him, right? It's never really the 11th hour to him. It's never really the first hour to him. He just knows before anything starts exactly when I'm going to stop it. But to us, it always seems like he's intervening at the last moment. So in Isaac's story, I really like thinking of God as God is the God of the 11th hour. And to me, that gives me comfort. Why? Because right when I think there's no way out, that's when I should really understand that God exists. There's always a way out. And that way will be provided by him. Yes?
Sorry, before you could go. That's a serious question. Why do we say 11th hour, not 12th hour?
Because the 12th hour is the beginning of a new day. The 11th hour is the last hour before the next day starts. So like he's waiting to the last hour.
What if the problem isn't like remembering that there is a way out, but more of thinking that it's not God's will for you to get out of it.
But the issue is that what we want to know about God is that his character is that he's God of the 11th hour, but it doesn't mean I'm going to see it coming. It doesn't mean I'm going to know the exit strategy, right? But there is not a single time ever in the history of humanity where God did not save. So why would he start with me? Like why am I going to be the
I'm
first
that bad.
person?
'Cause I'm that bad.
There's no way,
He's
right?
like, who's that one?
There's no way I'm that bad, right? So God is the God of the 11th hour. So you think about Isaac, think about when he was saved, and recognize that this is a version of God's character. Now we move to Jacob. Okay?
4 minutes, Amber.
Gosh, I tried. And I want you guys to open with me Genesis 25. And we're going to start at verse 23. Right? Because for us to figure out God in the story of Jacob, we're going to have to understand the character that God created in Jacob and how he chose to deal with it. Jacob is a very interesting person. Genesis 25, verse 23. So, in Genesis 25, verse 23, the her that is in that first line is Rebekah, okay? Isaac's wife. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 people shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. I know in English it doesn't make sense. You're like, what does the word Jacob have to do with heel? But in Arabic it's a lot more understandable because the words are actually close. Yaqub to Ka'b, right? So it just means the guy who's holding on to the heel, right? That's what Jacob actually means.
That's very
Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And before we go into the next part, I want you to think with me, for example, who is Jacob? Right? Is this a guy that has an easy life? Does Jacob have an easy life?
No.
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 If you think about it, Jacob is a man that is filled, his life is filled with struggles, even from the time of the womb.
Yeah.
Even from the time of the womb, Jacob and Esau were fighting inside the womb. Like, Rebekah always felt like something was wrong inside her womb, that there's like these 2 babies not getting along inside, right? So Jacob starts his struggle in the womb, which is a very weird thing, but the Bible talks about that to highlight something, right? That this is going to be a man of struggle. Some struggles are going to be his making, and some struggles are not going to be his making, right? But the first aspect of God's character as we study Jacob is, I want you to think of God and when he starts talking to Jacob. Does anybody know?
Obviously the ladder, so is it before them?
Very good. The first time is when he leaves his home. After what does he do?
It's identity fraud.
The blessing.
It's identity fraud.
Steals the blessing, and he does this whole thing with Esau, right?
It's identity fraud, guys.
Identity fraud, basically, with a hairy
Spread 'em
arm,
out, guys.
right? Identity fraud with a hairy arm.
Yeah.
So, Jacob is meant to be the father of the Israelites, and he's meant to have this huge future. And he's the third out of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? But one of the characters of God is God sometimes is the silent, present God. Right? He lets things happen because they are always a part of his plan. So a lot of times we wonder to ourselves, why is God not involved this moment? And sometimes God is saying, keep going. I'm going to stay silent. But he's present. So here's the difference. Sometimes we think God is like a missing God. And he's never a missing God. But sometimes he is a silent God. For example, in the life of Jacob. Jacob started struggling right from the womb. He comes out, and you can tell in the Bible that he's not exactly the one that's loved by dad, right? These are two boys, they're twins, and he can tell his dad loves his older brother a little bit more. His older brother is the hunter, he's the cool kid in town, he's the one that's going and getting the game, and dad is eating from him, and what does Jacob do? He's a tent dweller, right? Like that's how the Bible describes him. Gamba mama, biyudbukh. Doing his little thing. Okay, I guess this is my lot in life, right? My brother is the eldest. He's going to get all the blessing. And so there's like a weird inner struggle inside the family already. Now, you would think, if God didn't want to be a silent God, if he wanted to really intervene all the time, he could have just made Jacob the eldest. He could have just made Jacob the hunter. He could have just made Jacob the one loved by dad. But he didn't. He allowed certain things to happen because he wants Jacob to be Jacob. This version of Jacob is what God wants. But as you look from the outside, you get the fact that sometimes God is silently present. So first characteristics, sometimes God is a silently present God. Jacob had a lot of struggles. He struggled in the womb. He struggled against his brother. He struggled with his dad, right? By deceiving him. He struggled with God. He struggled with his uncle. He struggled with his wives. And he struggled with his sons. So here's the man that God is supposed to be setting up to be the third patriarch. This is the beginning of the Israelites. And his life is filled with struggle. And if you're Jacob, you might think to yourself, Lord, why? Why can't you just intervene and fix these things? Right? But we'll see why. Because one, God sometimes is the silently present God. Now let's go to verse 31, Genesis 25. Just so we're clear, Jacob's story spans from Genesis 25 to Genesis 49. So we're not going to go through the whole chapters. We're just going to choose and pick little things that illuminate to us some of God's characteristics. Genesis 25 verse 31 says what? But Jacob said, sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me? Then Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him, and he sold his birthright. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And then we go to and we're going to read this next verse. It has nothing to do with Jacob, but there's a reason why we're reading. Genesis 26, verse 34 and 35. When Esau was 40 years old, he took as wives Judith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite. And they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. Just remember this part, right? Because we're going to find out later that Jacob didn't do the same thing. Jacob listened and saw that Esau, his brother, his choices were evil. His choices were grieving his parents, and Jacob didn't do the same. So we start seeing hints of the goodness inside Jacob, right? Yeah, he took his brother's, rights with a bowl of, Hats,
I think it was that.
right? And by the way, let me ask you a question. Was it wrong what he did?
Yes.
Very quick to answer.
I feel like no. That's what gets me. Like,
I think
he was
it is.
willing at
So
the
that
end
was
to
bad,
take
that's
that
good.
deal.
You were that.
The buying of the birthright may have been a sneaky move, but he was straightforward. He said, "Sell me your birthright. I'll give you some hats."
I don't think it that's
Right?
not.
And
that's not
Esau
like
said,
wrong.
"Okay."
I mean, yeah, Esau should
Right?
have said yes, but like I'm not. Like,
So
those are
selling the
wrong.
birthright is not exactly wrong from Jacob's side. He saw an opportunity, he stepped in. Not exactly the nicest thing to do as a brother. You could have just
That's what
given him
I'm
that.
saying. That's,
But
Maybe this
So
is
that's
11th
the-
hour, right? So that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm seeing.
Oh my
It's
God.
the 11th hour thing.
yeah.
I don't think we are called to abuse people in the 11th
Yeah,
hour
use
in their time of need.
Thank you. Thank you.
But I guess what I'm saying is, I want us to
Devil's
differentiate two
advocate.
things,
I
right?
understand.
Differentiate what Jacob did when he bought the birthright and what he did when he deceived his father.
You're right,
Two
because seeing
different
the father
things,
is
right?
definitely an obvious.
Wait, John, sorry, before we go
I still don't like this slide.
So is it
It's very
the
smart.
birthright? Was that what he saw from his father too, or
Say that again?
the birthright? That's different from the blessing, or that's the
Yes,
same thing?
different. And we'll explain what the difference is if you guys want to. But yeah.
Yes, please.
Sure. So, and then we go into Genesis 27, where we all know the story, so we're not going to read it. But you know, Isaac says, "Hey, I'm old." He tells this to Esau. "I'm old. Go get me some food. I want to bless you." Esau leaves. Rebecca hears it. Tells Jacob, "Let's play this trick on your dad." Very nice wife. Let's play this trick on your dad. You know, you need to take the blessing, not Esau. He plays the trick. He gets the blessing. Esau comes back with the food. Dad says, "Wait, what are you talking about? I already ate. Who are you?" He's like, "I am Esau." "Oh man, I must have given the blessing to somebody else." Freaks out, right?
So the blessing is given to just one person who would have given it to him too.
Yeah, I always ask this question. Why only one?
Why only one person?
Because the blessing that is given, it's not like a general blessing. It's the blessing that has to do with the family,
Hmm.
right? So you
Well, let's
become
carry
the
on.
leader of the family. You become the judge of the family. That comes with the birthright, and then you receive the blessing on top of the birthright. The birthright is all the physical things. The blessing is all the spiritual things, right? And they had to go hand in hand. So if you receive the birthright, you receive the blessing.
طب just a second.
Yes.
هو عايزك عارف انه عيسو باع البكورية.
No, nothing says that he knew.
Nothing says that. صح؟
No. So we see that Rebecca tells Jacob, "Go do this, trick your dad," blah, 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 right? And then we see a different kind or a different characteristic of God. And this one is our God is a patient God. Patient through what?
Everything.
Everything. Patient through our sins, patient through our wrongdoings, patient through all the times that we don't want to talk to him, right? If Jacob was meant to be the guy, God could have easily went to him and say, "Hey, you don't need to be a trickster. Let's do this the right way." But it was a part of the bigger plan. Because of the patience of God, he knew Jacob was going to come out second, and he's going to have to go through this deception, this being, not so straight. He's going to have to go through all that to become the Jacob at the end. Okay? But God is a very patient God. God waits for Jacob until he does all of this. Why? Because God wanted to make sure that Jacob is no longer attached to a human. When he was back home, who was he attached to?
His mom.
Mom. He was a mama's boy, right? And God says, "Okay, I'm going to have you go through all of that. And then when am I going to meet you for the first time?
No.
When you're outside of your comfort zone. When you're running away because now you think your brother is going to kill you," which he was, right? "Now I'm going to meet you." So a patient God lets things play out because he has a much bigger plan. He doesn't rush. We want a rushing God. We want a God that has no patience. That as soon as he sees something, he intervenes. And God says, no, that's not my plan. I know what comes tomorrow, so I can be patient. I know what comes a year from now, so I can be patient. We don't, so that's why his ask from us is have faith in me. Right? If I can have faith in God, then I also have faith in his patience. Right? So our God so far is what?
He's a silently present God.
Silently present God.
He's a patient God.
And is a patient God. Sometimes we also tell God, I want the results now. And God is saying, no. There's a lot of things that I don't give you the results now. Especially when you think about Jacob, one of the patience, like one of the things that show God patience, is how God waited to punish Jacob. He could have punished Jacob right away, but he didn't. Right? Because he understood the situation Jacob was in. He understood the weakness of Jacob. And he understood the sin of Jacob in its time. So he waited. When do we first start seeing God's punishment sit on Jacob?
Well, when he's choosing the wife, so he wanted the one wife, and instead the father did the same thing and tricked him, and he
Very
waited
good.
another 7 years to get him off him.
You deceived your dad,
So
you will
you're
be
gonna deceive
deceived
too.
back. Imagine, and so I was going through the story of Jacob with my daughters,
Okay.
and they looked at me and they said, Baba, would you have waited 14 years to marry Mama?
Yeah. No.
And I was like, honestly, I don't think so. And they were like, what? So Jacob loved Rachel more than you love Mama? And I was like, I just think Jacob was weird. I was like, you're gonna work 14 years to marry a woman? That's kind of crazy. I worked overtime to get her a ring. Like that's the max I could do, right? Like I did overtime for 6 months. All right, that's my level of love. But they were like, they couldn't comprehend 14 years. But what I realized is God is such a patient God. It doesn't have to be a big punishment all at once. It could be a very drawn out punishment that you can handle. So it's not drawn out because God wants the punishment to be long. But God knows who Jacob is and knows that if I give him a really strong punishment all of a sudden, that might break him. He might not be able to handle it. But if I give him a punishment that is attached with his love for Rachel, then he'll be able to handle that punishment. So even in how patient God is in choosing my punishment, he's always going to give me one that I can handle. I don't think I could have handled that one, so that's why.
Was your wife around when the girl said this?
Thank God.
I would have said the same thing.
I know you.
14 years? Come on, man, that's crazy. I mean, technically he was married to Rachel the second 7. So he worked for 7, got married to Leah, woke up the next day, flipped out, got married to Rachel, and then worked for another 7.
Oh, really?
And then he worked for another 7 for the flock.
Okay.
So he ended up working for Laban 21 years.
Yeah.
right?
I know.
But he was married to Rachel during the second 7 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
But back there, they lived to like 100, 200, so 14 years, like 6 years, 6 months.
Maybe that's why he was able to do it. I don't know. Like,
Oh
you
my
know.
God, good.
So I guess by comparison, like, would I work for Nancy for like a year and a half? Yeah, I could do that. A year and a half was doable.
Poor Nancy.
So,
I have her
It's
number.
like your internship.
yeah, it's like doing an internship for marriage.
That's funny.
What else do we know about the story? What other kind of characteristics do you think God shows us in Jacob's story?
Well, when you brought up the punishment, he's a very fair God.
Yeah,
and two
he's a
things,
fair God.
And how he chooses the punishment we can handle, and at what time he chooses to punish us.
True. But I think we've seen the fair God before in other stories. What other characteristics we haven't seen in other stories yet do you see in this story?
I don't know if this is the right word, but calculating.
Calculating. We talked about our precise God before, right?
Okay.
Have we ever seen the tough love God before?
What do you mean?
Several times.
I don't think we've ever mentioned it as a characteristic.
None of the characteristics, but like in what I see from the Bible.
In Jacob's story, we see that God has various types of love. With Jacob, it was tough love. It wasn't like tup love. Like it was, Bas I love you. Right? How? First, we saw Jacob get chased out of his house.
True.
Right? Then we saw the Lord give Jacob a permanent limp.
Oh yeah.
Right? When he struggled with the Lord, when nothing could happen, what did God do? He touched his socket.
Yep.
And for the rest of his life, he walked with a limp.
Mhm.
Right? And then deceived by his uncle for 21 years. And then he experiences the perceived death of Joseph, his favorite son. Goes blind because of it. He has 12 sons that don't really love each other. He has 4 wives, or 2 wives and 2, whatever, that don't also love each other. He has famine in his time. When you look at the way God loved Jacob, Jacob needed tough love. Because Jacob was a difficult person. A good person, but a difficult person. So we see a version of God, we see this characteristic of God, that our God can dish out some tough love. It's really according to you. The more resistance, the more tougher the love has to be. But it's still love because at the end it's for what?
My sake.
For his salvation. If Jacob didn't experience all these things, he wouldn't be one of the fathers, the patriarchs that we talk about today. Right? But because of who he was, because of his personality, he required tough love. Let's see what else. In the story of the ladder, does anybody know the ladder of Jacob? What? Tell me.
Okay, I might miss some details, but so basically, like you said, he had to escape the house because his brother was going to kill him, and crucified. And so he ends up going to, I don't remember what the place is called. I think it's called the Rock or something, close to that.
What
that
happens
place.
there?
So
That's the big
he's
piece.
sleeping, and a ladder came down from. Well, he thought he had a dream. That a ladder came down, and the angels were like descending and ascending through it, and I think God's voice says something along the lines of like, "I am here, or I'm with you, like, I never left you." And so Jacob wakes up, basically feeling like God's presence for the first time, and God commands him like to go wherever he leads him.
So the ladder in Jacob reveals a very interesting part of God. We realize that God loves connections. He loves to build connections, right? When he takes Jacob and says, like, he doesn't say to him, but when he puts Jacob, allows him to go in a situation where he has to run away, first thing God does is he shows Jacob a ladder that is going between earth and heaven with angels going up and down. So Jacob in his life knew 3 things, right? He knew his dad, he knew his mom, and he knew his brother. And when he left the house, he lost all 3 at the same time. And God wasn't going to let him be like an orphan in the middle of nowhere. So he showed him 3 things. He showed him God, he showed him the angels, and he showed him the ladder to heaven. Because God wants to build connections with Jacob, right? So the first time we see the connection building God is through the ladder. He's connecting heaven and earth for Jacob's sake to say, I am not far away. I'm connected. There's a ladder that can come right up to heaven. Very different than the Tower of Babel, when people wanted to be the ones that connect to heaven bilafia, and God said, no, not happening, right? I'm the one that builds the connections for all of you. And then we see him as the connection building God when he puts these 12 boys who really kind of don't like each other because they come from 4 different moms. but he builds enough between them to build the 12 tribes of Israel. And we see a nation come out of 12 half brothers, 6 from Leah, 2 from Rachel, and 2 from Bilhah and Milhah, or Zilpah and Bilhah, some weird names, right? So God builds a connection between all 12 of them just so the unifying nation of Israel comes out. And then the choice of Rachel. Yeah.
Alright. Going back to the 12. Are we all out of one tribe?
We're out of none of the tribes. None of us are from Israel. We're Gentiles.
I believe that,
Yeah?
The Gentiles still don't have to go there.
Hey, not from the 12 tribes of Israel. We are Gentiles. We don't belong to Israel at all. Spiritually, we're the sons of Abraham. But physically, we're Gentiles. We're from Egypt. We had nothing to do with Israel.
But Adam does.
Yeah, of course, yes. If we're going to go all the way back, then we are the sons of Shem, I think.
But
Shem?
after, because we studied Noah. We studied Noah, مش كده?
Shem?
Yeah, but
Shem was the other.
Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the 3 sons of Noah. I think the Middle East,
Yeah.
Egypt, Iraq, all of these guys were the sons of Shem.
Shem.
Okay.
So we are technically, if you want to know, like, who's your great-great-great-grandfather,
And then
is
the-
Shem and then Noah.
The
Right?
Egyptians in particular were the son of Misraim. There's a Misraim that even that the name of Egypt, Nasr, is that belonged to that because his generation lived in this area, like North Africa.
Yeah, so we're not a part of the 12 tribes of Israel. We're a completely different lineage than that. Another way we see God trying to connect with Jacob is in giving him Rachel. Right? Like we said, there's a punishment that's going to come. But it didn't have to come in a completely dry land. He gave him حاجة حلوة كده في النص. He's like, خد Rachel. So he was happy, right? We also see a big time connection in the story of Jacob towards the end of his life, when everything that he thought he lost in his son Joseph, he ends up finding. So God doesn't sever that connection all the way till he dies. He lets him suffer. He lets him experience like regret and blindness and all this stuff to cleanse him, but then reconnects him with his favorite son before he dies. So we really see that God is a God that loves connecting people, loves to connect himself to us. And the last characteristic that I found in the story of Jacob is God is the perfectly protective God. Right? He is not a God that like doesn't care, lets me suffer beyond. Here's a couple of times when. Like we said before, God appears to Jacob on his way to Laban's house. Does anybody tell me why specifically on his way to Laban's house?
I don't remember this verse.
When Jacob was going to Laban's house, God appears to Jacob. What happened? Why?
You just said he was his mom, dad, and his brother.
That's one aspect. Why else? Think from a protective aspect. What was about to happen to Jacob when he gets to Laban's house?
Did it set deception of or working for the 7 year?
Forget about the deception. Something much more important that shows how protective God is of his children. Think about who Laban is. Think about his household. Was Laban like a guy who loved God?
No, it's after the story time.
Well,
Who did Laban worship? Idols.
oh, okay.
Right? If God was not a protective God,
He would have worship.
he wouldn't have introduced himself at the right time. But he knew that Jacob was about to go into a land and to live with a people for 21 years that worship idols. So if God didn't introduce himself on a very personal level to Jacob, what would have Jacob done?
The idol worship.
He would have worshipped idols. So God is very protective of his children, even when it comes to timing. Because sometimes we think to ourselves, I'm going somewhere and everybody there is not godly. God is saying, don't worry about it. I got you. I'll introduce a new person in your life that'll bring God. I'll introduce a new meeting in your life that'll give you spiritual strength. I'll introduce a new activity in your life at the same time that makes sure you can hold on strong and not be weakened. So God chooses the perfect time to meet Jacob because he is perfectly protective of his children. He wasn't going to allow for Jacob to become an idol worshiper. Yeah.
Sorry. Laban, was he the only one worshiping idols in his family?
His household.
So how come Rachel and him were Christian?
They were what?
Not
They weren't Christian, first of all.
Jewish.
And they weren't Jewish, because there is no such thing as being Jewish yet. Just so we're clear.
So they're from the,
But do you
what if the
still worship
Israelites?
with idols? Because
Well, we don't know. All we know is that Rachel took the idols when she went to leave her dad's house.
But she was promoted to
Okay.
be the grandmother of Jesus.
Actually, Rachel is not the grandmother of Jesus. Leah is the grandmother of Jesus.
Oh, okay.
Just so we're clear. Jesus comes from the line of Judah. Judah came from Leah.
Okay.
Okay.
We think that he came from Joseph. He didn't come from Joseph. He came from Judah. We just love Joseph.
Okay.
But the lineage, Jesus comes from Judah. But either way, there was whores in the lineage of Jesus. There was sinners. There was like that's not the reason, right? Like that's not what's gonna stop us. So I don't know. All we know is that she took the idols with her when she left. A part of it was, I think she was also taking them to kind of get on her dad's nerves. Because her dad was not going to give her any of her inheritance. So she took the idols as like getting back at him.
It's funny.
Whether she was worshiping the idols with Laban and her brothers or not, we don't know. So, on the way back, Jacob is coming back from Laban. 21 years passed, and he's heading back. And what is still on his mind?
His brother's gonna kill him.
My brother's going to kill me. 21 years later, Esau's going to see me, and he is going to kill me. This time, God doesn't just appear to him. God actually sends him first a multitude of angels. Why? Because our God is a perfectly protective God. He is revealing to Jacob,
I got you.
hey, listen, I got an army of angels. You really don't have to worry about your brother. It gives Jacob a little bit of a comfort.
Don't
But-
let me hear. I'm sorry, I forgot this part of the story. I told you, can you just remind me of this part of the story? I can't remember it.
Genesis 32, verse 1 and 2. It's the part where Jacob is coming back, and he sits and he has a dream, and God shows him a multitude of angels. And then God talks to him. But he shows him the multitude of angels first. And it was God saying, look, don't worry about Esau. I got you. You're fine. Did Jacob listen 100%?
No.
What did he end up doing that tells us he didn't listen?
So he ended up having part of the caravan like going ahead with the gifts, just so he could appease his brother before he comes to show his face.
Not just so he can appease his brother. He also sent out some of his wives and children first, and then another group of wives and children. And he's like, okay, he's going to kill anybody. Maybe he'll kill them, and I'll have enough time to run away. Right?
Oh,
This
I
is
did not get that part.
this is Jacob,
Okay.
right? So
But he also sent gifts and stuff.
yeah, I mean this.
I mean, just.
Let's not focus on the part where
it
he
was
he'll
not
just sacrifice his wives and
He
his
was
children.
schmoozing,
Okay.
but there was a part of him that was like, you know, if he's gonna kill somebody, I'm gonna hear about it, and I'll get my chance to
Well,
run.
he knows the
Right?
cycle of.
That's still smart, but like, dear Lord.
He knows the cycle of Esau, that he's a guy that likes to take gifts and materials, so he sends them the stuff to people.
You know, another person that God was very protective of was Leah herself. The Bible repeats something about Leah,
Is it
where he
because-
says what? And she was not loved by her husband.
Yeah, that part always says.
Can someone like?
So what does God do for Leah? He opens her womb. I want you to understand something about Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. And I know this is going to sound kind of, not appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
But I need you to understand this,
Mhm.
right? Jacob didn't sleep with Leah a lot. He only slept with Rachel. So Leah was very lonely. But every time Jacob slept with Leah, what happened?
There's a child.
They had a kid.
She got pregnant. So I want you to understand how protective God is. To the point of, I know the emotional state of Leah. I'm going to bless her so much that the few times her husband lays with her, I will give her kids. And she gets 4 kids before anyone else has kids. Alright? Jacob has no kids. Nobody's bearing anything. Rachel's, as many times as he's trying to sleep with her, nothing's happening. A couple of times he sleeps with Leah, she gets him 4 kids. I want you to understand 4 kids means 9 months of pregnancy, right? This is a long time, right?
Mhm.
But Leah's the only producer in the house. And she says in the Bible, she gets the first kid and she says, maybe my husband will love me. Nope, he's still sleeping with Rachel. She gets the second kid, maybe my husband will love me. Nope, he's still sleeping with Rachel. I want you to understand from a woman's perspective, right? This is anguish. This is breaking her. And God says, no. I am a protective God. I love my children. So for you, Leah, I'm going to open your womb 4 times before anybody else. And then Rachel, out of bad jealousy, when she says, you know what, take my maid and go have kids with her. She gives him 2 kids. Bardo Rachel is nothing. Leah says, you know what, she gave you a maid, I can give you a maid too. Take my maid. Right? He has 2 kids with her. All of this, God is protecting who?
Yeah.
Leah. And then finally, Rachel gives. Now, after those 2 kids, Leah gets 2 more. So now Leah has 6. And then Rachel gets 2 and dies with the second one, giving birth to the second. So, if you want to know what God's character is in this part of the story, God is super protective of Leah's emotions. Because just think about what was happening. Her dad used her in a ploy to get Jacob to work more. I want you to imagine Leah on her wedding night. What did she know?
If she was not Rachel.
But what did she know? Who was Jacob sleeping with that night?
Her, not
In his mind, who was he sleeping with?
Rachel.
Rachel. So, if you talk about anguish in the story, Leah's life was a very difficult life. And God chooses to give her half of the tribes of Israel as her children to compensate her on the anguish that she had to live. From the moment she was given to Jacob, he didn't want her. All the way until the end of her life, he didn't really want her. But God gave her 6 out of 12 children. 3 other women added together produced what Leah produced.
So Joseph belongs to who?
Joseph is the first son of Rachel. And then Benjamin is the second one, and that's when Rachel died, giving birth to him.
Did Leah know that she was deceiving Jacob? Was she aware?
Of course. But, and that's the other thing, is that she knew and she could say nothing.
Ruka has a
Her dad says, go,
Not be
cover your face, and this is how I'm going to get rid of you, because nobody's going to marry you. You have weak eyes. Here's our chance. Cover your face and go sleep with this guy, and now you're his wife. This is how Leah's life started in the story.
Lord.
Very difficult. Very difficult life. What did you say?
Ruka has a question for you.
Yes.
How God is a protective God since that's happened to Leah?
Isn't Leah considered the side, like the side piece?
The side piece?
Like how is he?
Not even a side piece, to be honest.
The side piece.
No, Leah is considered
the answer to the
I want you to look at Leah from two different eyes, right? Look at Leah from the eyes of society, to include her dad and her husband and everybody, and then look at Leah from the eyes of her maker. From the eyes of society, yeah, she's the side piece. She's the one nobody wants, right? But from her maker's eyes, she's the one that gives birth to Judah, the great 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 grandfather of Jesus. So there's a very big difference between God being a protective God and the world doing what it wants to do. So yeah, was Leah the side piece by the world standard? Yes. But by God's standard? No. She's Jesus' great 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 grandmother.
Didn't you say Leah was used, God used Leah to deceive Jacob because he deceived his father? So
Now,
how?
God didn't use Leah to deceive Jacob, but he knew that the punishment was going to come this way because Leah's dad is evil.
Okay.
When somebody evil deceives somebody evil, God is not involved, but it is justice happening between them.
But God allows it. because of
God allows it as a form of punishment. When God lifts his protection from Israel, and a nation would come in and kill the Israelites because the Israelites were not listening to God. He's not really forcing the evil people to come kill the Israelites. This is what they wanted to do to begin with. All he did is say, okay, you don't want to be with me, Israelites? I will remove my protection. We can't say God is the evil one, but he won't protect you if you don't want the protection. But for somebody like Leah who had no options, he was a protective God. He protected her emotions, he protected her status in the family, because nobody else was going to protect Leah. Jacob didn't like her, her dad wanted to get rid of her, her sister didn't care, At no Do you guys know that Rachel, if you read the story carefully, Leah had, I think it was mandarins, like fruits, right? And Rachel went to Leah and said, hey, give me some of your fruits. And Leah said, isn't it enough that you take my husband? Okay, man, you want to take the fruits that my son made? You know what Rachel said to Leah?
I forgot.
She said, okay, I'll make a deal with you. You give me some of the fruits that your son made or grew, and I'll tell my husband to go sleep with you.
Wow.
Do you guys see?
Rachel's not.
I just
She has this characteristic.
I want to tell you guys something. There are things in the Bible that if you notice, you're gonna see real life happening in the Bible, right? These are two sisters, and one sister is telling the other one, I'll let my husband, who happens to be her husband too, sleep with you for some oranges. Do you understand the craziness? But this is what Leah was living in.
Dear.
Because Jacob never went to sleep with her. She was nothing. He didn't like her. But God loved her and gave her 6 out of 12 tribes of Israel.
But that wasn't Jacob's fault from the first place. He didn't want her from the first place.
Doesn't matter. He could have showed her love.
He could have at least respected her.
respect.
But
At least.
God didn't care what Jacob or her father or anybody was doing. He had a plan for her.
We don't know anything about Rachel and what's her name, Leah's relationship together before they were married to.
We-
Enmity's kind of
we
shown
don't-
afterwards.
We don't know anything about the relationship before marriage,
Okay.
but we can tell a lot from the relationship after marriage.
Definitely. I mean, just the orange story, you can tell the enmity between them.
Yeah, there's not good feelings happening between Rachel and
No.
Leah, right? So, to go over what we were talking about. I highlight these little stories because I feel like we all read Jacob's story, but we don't stop at these things and understand what's actually happening, right? There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of living happening in the Bible. The Bible is not just some words on a paper, right? So we have the silently present God, the patient God, the tough love God, the connection building God, and the perfectly protective God. If you think none of these apply to your life, think about your life a little bit. You're going to find at times God was silent. You thought he wasn't present, but he was just silent. Very big difference between the two. He's present, but he's silent. He's waiting. There's a time for everything under the heavens. And sometimes we don't understand that he is the God of the 11th hour, because we're bothered by that. We want to be saved at the 4th hour or the 5th hour. And he's saying, no. Purifying you only happens around the 11th hour. My favorite one is the perfectly protective God, because I like that about him. I don't have to worry too much. Even if I'm a Siamese.
That's your Lord.
And glory be to God forever, amen.
For a long time, are you?